Sure. First, I want to say thank you, Gabi, and everybody for inviting me and being here today. And it's an honor to be with you. And I'm really excited to hear about your focus on the humanities and emergent work on the digital era. I think it's great that you're focusing on this with a series of speakers, and I'm really pleased to be part of that series. So you asked me about my field. My PhD is in film and media studies. And this is an emergent field in the humanities that builds on past work in literary studies, cultural history, sociology, political theory, cultural studies, and more. And, this field really focuses on the history and even contemporary formations of mechanically generated motion pictures and sounds, including cinema, television and video, digital imagery, games, and now even virtual reality. And the field that I am in approaches media of different kinds, from historical and formal and aesthetic and critical and analytical perspectives. And the goal is really to build on kind of mid-century work by people like Marshall McLuhan and understand the mediated environment and technologies that we as humans are immersed within and that are shaping us in ways that have to do with our thinking and ideologies, as well as our entertainment culture and our political systems. So my early work branched off from a focus in our field that was really on film and radio and TV. And I realized that not a lot of people had focused on satellite technology. And I was interested in thinking about the satellite, not just as a kind of relay tower in orbit, but as a technology that was a media technology, as a technology that was actively trying to make sense of and transform life on Earth. And so in order to think about satellite as a kind of, infrastructure, a media infrastructure that could not be seen or touched in the same way as a radio or a telephone or a TV set, I examined a bunch of different satellite related content to try to make this technology more intelligible and palpable to readers of my first book. And so I looked at live international satellite transmissions. I analyzed remote sensing images and astronomical images, and also looked at global positioning systems and really tried to explore these topics in my book, Cultures in Orbit. And I remember at the time, people in media studies thought I was a little crazy. They thought, why isn't she looking at radio or TV broadcasting or film content? How can we think about something like a satellite image within the rubrics that we had in the humanities? And so I really had to make the case in that book as to how and why the satellite was something we couldn't see or touch, but was actively shaping our everyday lives all around the world. And so just to wrap up a response to this question, I've been interested in not only satellites that we can't see and touch directly because they're launched into orbit, but I'm interested in how they structure fields like broadcasting and archaeology, military monitoring of the war theater, astronomical observation, and how we understand what's called by astrophysicists the edge of time. And I argue that these orbital technologies don't just sit out there inert. They are very active, and they are used to remediate life on Earth. And in my most recent book, which is called Rethinking Media Coverage, I call this practice vertical mediation, because I'm interested in how these technologies that are aerial and orbital generate images that are used to change the material structure and surface and conditions of life on Earth. So focusing on satellites led me to think about all kinds of other media infrastructures And I've done a lot of research in recent years on that's more field-based, where I go out in the field and actually use phenomenological practices and observational methods. And I look at things like broadcast towers, earth stations, mobile phone towers, and data centers, and try to find a kind of critical poetics and humanities-based language for making sense of these technological objects that are all over the built environment, but that we're socialized not to see, so to speak, and we're socialized not to be interested in them. We're socialized to think about them as the boring stuff of infrastructure, not something that's exciting, like a screen or an interface or a framed image. That's probably a long-winded answer, but that may kind of allow us to enter into more of a dialogue. And if you want me to say anything further about any of those issues, I'd be glad to.
It is a long answer because it is a lot of things you're looking into. So, and of course, there are lots of questions. What I wanted to tell you, your books are wonderful and your texts are great in the way they manage to get all this very complex and mixed kind of information. And as you say, what we are, I think it's fascinating that we are socialized to think of it as boring, and how when they are told in a different manner, you and some of the authors you bring into your compilations also, they become like science fiction stories. You can't stop reading, but they are not science fiction. They are our daily reality. No? So I think that's one very important task of humanist researchers, and being able of translating it that way for the general public is really very well done. So your books are great on this. And I'm going to skip a question. I may come back later on, but since you're mentioning all these different kind of knowledges you have been through, what we've seen in our conversation is that this very complex reality we're living in today demands from the researcher a lot of very complex knowledges. And you have been speaking about critical analysis, but also geography, geology, history, law, you name it. How do you deal with this? How have you developed some sort of methodologies completely different? A humanist 100 years ago didn't have to know all these different kinds of things. So how do you go about it yourself and your colleagues, and anything you would like, any tips to share with colleagues who are on the same way? More than tips, no, your method.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that because I'm from an emergent field in the humanities, that is media studies, there's a sense that we have certain liberties and creative license to invent our field and invent the way we go about doing research in our field. And I have really enjoyed that aspect of academic work and life, being in a field that allows one to explore, be curious, go off the beaten path, and not reiterate already sedimented knowledge formation. So I would say that there's also, just as we could talk about how certain fields have certain affordances and abilities that invite us to do things a little differently, I would say that some researchers, are trained and prefer to engage in deep specialization in a narrow area of study, and they commit their lives to this kind of practice. It's almost like a monastic practice, and return to and going deeper and deeper into a certain kind of investigation. And on the other hand, others aspire to more breadth and jumping around, indulging their various curiosities. And I definitely, as you probably can gather if you've read any of my work, fall into this latter category. I feel a kind of restlessness in the academy. I'm constantly feeling grateful that I have a job, but I also always want to think about my object of study beyond the walls of the university and get out into the field and think about physical artifacts and also people and communities that live around and in relation to those artifacts. So I try to find these objects and sites and people and power relations that I'm interested in exploring and studying. And then I read as much as I can across disparate fields, across like multiple fields. So my research practice is highly interdisciplinary. And, as you mentioned, I tend to engage a lot with cultural geography, sociology, international relations, and art. That's not to say that I regularly read journals in all of these disciplines, but I try my hardest to contextualize an issue or a problem across multiple disciplinary perspectives, because I think the kinds of concerns and problems that we deal with in media studies cannot be contained in the box of media studies. They're also problems or issues that are relevant to questions in other disciplines and fields. And so by engaging in this way, I feel like we're reading across these divides, we're thinking across these divides and sharing our work rather than reiterating the walls that disciplines tend to produce. So I should also say that my goal as a researcher is never to produce a kind of omniscient or total perspective on an issue. I'm really influenced by post-structuralist feminism and science and technology studies that, such as the work of Donna Haraway, that emphasizes research and understanding as partial, as relational, and as a kind of process of creating situated knowledges rather than grand proclamations about the truth. So some probably would not be satisfied with that kind of approach because it doesn't always lead to deep specialization. Instead, it's a research practice that's committed to provocation and sharing and inquisitive, sometimes even agitational behavior. In the scholars that I've been really influenced by, I think also are people who have dared to try to think between and beyond their own milieu. So I hope that gives some perspective on that issue.
Absolutely, and you can tell that in your text. And you mentioned art, and I've seen you have collaborated with artists in different moments, and I had the feeling this is because maybe artists can render visible some processes or some things that the classical scientists or the classical map making or so can't. They are not equipped to do it. Could you tell us a little bit about some of these experiences or give us one of the examples of how you work together with artists?
Yes, I have throughout my youth, I've always been very interested in art and art practice. And I have worked with a lot of artists. I've fallen in love with artists. I'm constantly inspired by art, not just as kind of objects that are aesthetic, but as projects and practices. And I have had the great privilege of collaborating with artists and learning from artists. And as a humanities-based scholar, I find that what often happens is there are these kind of knowledge hierarchies that form between the humanities and the arts. And I work with a group of people at UC Santa Barbara who have done incredible work making the case that there are all kinds of amazing research practices and methods that emerge from artistic practice and work. And so I have often thought about the arts, not just as objects of the gaze or to be looked at, but as kind of gold mines for thinking about research from more experimental and creative perspectives. And when I, as a scholar first trained in media studies and visual culture, I approached infrastructure, whether I was thinking about satellite or a broadcast transmission tower, as a problem of visual representation. Because, you can't show visually an entire national or international network in a single image, photographic image. You could only show it as a network map or a flow diagram. So that created a challenge of representation that I became really interested in. And as you mentioned, I did work with artists because they helped me think through what it meant to represent an entire infrastructure and how we might do that in a way that didn't just repeat the schematic diagrams of designers or urban planners. How could we be more playful and poetic and creative about putting an infrastructure into an artistic rendition and then getting visitors or publics to come to an exhibition and think through their relationship to that infrastructure? So I've worked with artists in Europe and in Brazil, in Tanzania and Zambia, and tried to really just have dialogues with them in ways that inspired my thinking and my abilities as a researcher. And I continue, I'm working right now on a project called Data Centered, which is with myself and 3 artists, because I'm doing kind of the more humanities-based research on what does it mean for these data centers to be emerging in throughout the African continent. And the artists were having weekly dialogues about how they think about what it might be to represent these facilities in ways that get publics more interested in them and what's happening inside of them, so that then they have a kind of political interest or stake in the datification of our territories. So that's just an example of a recent project I'm working on, but I have done a number of multimedia installations based on some of my field-based work on infrastructure and different sites, ranging from the former Yugoslavia to Mongolia, and other sites as well.
And I think all these different kinds of knowledge we've been talking about come together in these labs, the one you founded in the MIT and the one you're now directing in Santa Barbara. Can you tell us a little bit about those labs, what their aim is, how you work in there, what kind of people work there?
Sure. So I had previously directed a research center at UC Santa Barbara called the Center for Information Technology and Society, or CITS. And that experience allowed me to bring together and work with people from different fields, not just artists, but I also got to work with computer scientists, political scientists, historians, and so on. And so when I moved to MIT, one of the things that I wanted to try to do when I got there was to create a lab that would have a primary goal of bringing people together across fields to do field-based research in media and communication studies. But I also wanted to create kind of a professional space for students and even community members to do collaborative research together. So our goal was to get grants and then do community-based research projects where I could take students from MIT to other countries, other communities in the US, to learn about technology, especially media and information technology, from across these diverse sites. So I wanted us to get out of, wanted us to get out of the walls of the Institute and go into the field together and work with people and organizations in different contexts. And so one of the first ones we did was to work with the Dar es Salaam Institute of Technology in Tanzania. And we do these workshops called social IT solutions, which bring together perspectives from the humanity on the history of technology, as well as computer scientists who are trying to do coding and problem solving using software and mobile phone apps, and even network system design. And so I'd basically try to get a grant, and then it would take the students there, and we worked together in the same site intensively all day for about 2 or 3 weeks. And it was very interesting from a cultural perspective too, because we were working with multiple languages, translators, and also academic disciplines and practices. But I have to say that I've been in academia almost 25 years now, and these workshops with students in different countries I've learned more through them than anything. Just seeing students engage with one another, try to use technology to solve problems, try to reflect on the limits of technology in solving problems, and recognizing the fact that we need to work together across national borders in order to address and think through the complexity of the issues and problems that we face as a world. So we did the same thing in Salvador, Brazil in January 2020. We had about a 2 or 3 week workshop with the Federal University of Bahia and the State University of Southwestern Bahia. And again, it was computer scientists, artists, and humanists working together. And there's a lot of information online for people who may want to look at the documentation of the projects we did and the students and faculty members who were involved. To sum it up, I mean, the goal of this lab is called Global Media Technologies and Cultures Lab. It's kind of a mouthful. I tried to get every word in there.
And you're used to it.
We call it GymTech Lab for short.
GymTech, okay, good.
Yeah, the website is still up at MIT and there's a lot of content on there, but I've just moved it to UC Santa Barbara in the context of the pandemic, and we've tried to begin events there too. And we're in the process of finishing up a project with the Blackfeet Nation, which is a Native American community in Montana. And we've been working with them for a few years and doing a research project too. So it's bringing together students and researchers to do field-based research where we collaborate and learn about technology in particular sites and contexts.
Well, it sounds great and sounds complicated because of the languages and the travel, especially in these times, but sounds great. And I was going to ask you about hubs, this kind of thinking hubs outside the US, but you mentioned already the one in Dar es Salaam and the ones in Brazil. Are there other centers around the world you think are particularly interesting on how they are working with these issues?
I know there are, and I've worked with different ones, and I don't have a whole list in my head right now.
Okay.
But I do think that universities are often very massive learning environments where students can feel a little bit alienated and isolated, and they're very hierarchical environments. And I think that it's really important for us to think about what kinds of learning spaces are ideal. And I think those that bring people together across different languages and cultures that are kind of more small and intimate, that have a limited time span. We don't have to I think you can learn a lot in a 3-week, really intensive workshop. And my students and participants in these have told me that. What I'm trying to get at here is just to think about the different models for humanities-based learning that are possible. It doesn't have to just be, sitting in an armchair reading in a book. In the digital era, we need to continue to think about across languages, across cultures, and even if we have the resources, bring ourselves together for a limited amount of time and really do the rigorous translation work that's needed to think across cultures in a more collaborative way. And it might be a kind of idealized way of approaching research, but I have really learned a lot through this process, and we'll be writing this up in a new book that I'm working on called Mixed Signals, which focuses a lot on some of the infrastructure work I've been doing over the past decade.
And it seems especially relevant because for your field, where these technologies are developed and even funded and thought of by a few nations, even a few companies in these nations, but then the effect is felt worldwide. So the way of understanding this and the probable solutions or way to live with these technologies have to come from the whole world, I guess, from this kind of interactions.
I couldn't agree more. And you had raised a question previously about education and technology and democracy.
Yes.
And I think that, some technologies have democratizing potentials, but these same technologies can also have totalitarian tendencies. So there's often this dialectic of freedom and control that we need to think about in relation to technological development and use. Humanists approach technology not for technology's sake, but usually to problematize or question or critique something about the definition or use of technology, and often in relation to power formations or power related issues. So, I think that it's quite important to think about, to not just embrace this techno democracy ideal. We have, social media have a lot of democratizing uses or potentials, but as we've seen in the world in the past, decade, they can also be used by authoritarian and repressive and also in polarizing ways. So some of my recent work has looked at issues and ideologies of so-called internet freedom, and how both authoritarian and democratic regimes alike are regulating social media content in partnership with big tech companies. So the priority seems to be the contracts between states and big tech companies, and often publics who are the users are the ones that lose out in a lot of these equations and relations. So I think it's vital that we keep thinking about the concepts and ideals of democracy and empowerment in relation to technology, but they need to be thought about in very specific and contextualized ways.
Absolutely, and that was something we spoke about in the last meeting, how, for example, we have to sign, as a common user, we have to sign some legal avowals or agreements, which are like pages long, no one reads them, and well, that's where humanists or researchers can sometimes take a look and say, hey, this has to change, and also use the imagination to think of ways this could be different, which is the tough part here. I would like to, I have here Jerry de la Paulera, the director of the foundation. He is sending me a message. He has a question for you. So if you're okay, I'm gonna tell him, Jerry, join us and just go ahead.
Okay, now I'm okay. I'm allowed now. So, Lisa, no, I have so many questions, in fact, to ask you, but I will be very selfish. And I will be very selfish because of the time. And I will be asking you, some reflection about how this translates to the education at the primary and secondary level. Let's suppose you have a revolution, you are doing a revolution in the sense that, for example, at Fundación Bunge y Born, we are doing a small revolution in STEAM, in science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, where we have scholars outside the walls of the university, everybody with PhDs, that they are putting their time to produce very important and innovative courses for teachers across the country, with virtual labs in order, to overcome the scarcity of resources in more needy areas. So we are right now have produced 400 courses, and therefore the aim of our reflections in these seminars, or my aim, is that I would like to have a trickle-down effect on how we can reproduce this in the humanities side, on what was called beforehand, before you mixed humid and hard stuff, what was called soft sciences or humanities, how we should go about it. So how we should, and I read a lot about this, and as you just said, the humanists looks at technology. There is always there is a trade-off between being deep and what you should learn or know about the humanities. The other question is, what means humanities in the digital era? Because in your field, you are you have exploded this. The humanities means another thing given the digital era. And when you read the chronicle of higher education or all that stuff, and in university, I agree with you that the university is a medieval type of middle-aged type of structure. It's hard to say for me because I'm a founding rector of a research university in Argentina. So, but I think that the university is totally obsolete in terms of what is the future. How would you have some reflection about how you would address, this aspect, because there is all this tendency that to be successful, you have to manage obviously mathematics, obviously you have to be programmers, so you can go basically to work in Accenture, to work in Amazon, you will make money very, very fast as a young, you can do a startup. But my question, I'm a social scientist, I'm an economist, but I am an economic historian, so I did a concession and I do some history also. So what it means, the future of this type of humanity? We want to go that way. The way, of course, not at the level of the experimental level you are doing, but have you thought, you said something about it because you talked about this research project that you have with young people over different communities, but what are your thoughts? What should we look at? Are there any examples in the world that as they are successful in the STEAM area, are they attempting something on the other side by asking themselves, what means the humanities today? And second, of course, how we should address this topic? We don't have a clue yet, so that's why we are asking you. Maybe maybe we can resolve immediately today this conundrum. I don't know if I was perfectly unclear, but so I think you will understand. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for your questions and comments. I think you're raising the questions that I think we're all trying to grapple with. What do we do as humanities scholars and students to contribute back to the society today? And how do we do it? Do we need to have, the model of the university is about the centralization of knowledge and power within a kind of architecture and an environment maybe we need more of a circulatory system model where we're not just always imagining ourselves sitting at a desk and at a computer, but actually out in the community and in the world and trying to understand the problems in a more proximate manner, not from the distance of the armchair, but in talking to the neighbors in the community. And I think that, the model of the digital infrastructure, the internet, was also part of the process of beginning to raise these questions of what should the university look like? Where do the humanities, what's the role of the humanities in this era? Because it basically started to change the possibilities of data collection and knowledge production and distribute them and make them more accessible, at least in certain parts of the world. I think we have to have focused workshops and conversations about this and create manifestos and models and start to disseminate them. I mean, there's a legacy in South America of public intellectuals who wanted to revolutionize higher education and K through 12 or primary and secondary as well. And I think we need to listen. We need to go back and listen and reflect upon those models and update them in relation to what we're all facing right now. And I think we're all facing different things based on where we are in the world and what our material conditions are. But we also have shared challenges of climate change and war and the pandemic and global poverty. And we need to think about how the humanities is organizing to play a role in addressing these issues too. So we probably could have a whole dinner or a whole week of conversation about the points that you raised. I'm really grateful, but that's my modest attempt in this context.
One thing that is very important, as Lisa mentioned, I think that, of course, this vicinity produced by the technology is something that allows us to be paradoxically more near these realities. In some sense, I think what Lisa, maybe the evolution is not to abstract humanities, but applied humanities in the sense, so we have a kind of an abstract humanity that, of course, is needed as a base, but you need, as you do empirical work, with some methodology, you are doing empirical work based, on the arts, the humanities, other types of issues. I think that applied humanities might be a thing that is totally an evolution vis-a-vis what you call the armchair type of professor who sends a traditional reading list and just read the reading list of these the big thinkers, and so this is the course, and then you will have a. So I think yes, I think that you have been for me it's very important what you have mentioned. I think that I will call it empirical humanities or something like that. But I fully agree with you. I mean, it's something that and you mentioned democracy. I mean, you mentioned also the interaction with democracy, and so you have the two, like a multiple equilibria there, because on the one side, the technology democratizes many things, but on the other hand is a temptation to go into your private lives, and so there is like a two equilibria. It's very subtle equilibria, this intervention in our lives of technology. So I think to have a sense of ethics in the teaching also, and a sense of of caring about others, or in the humanities, and thinking about those externalities is something very important. I think at the hour of knowing what are the new humanities, how they should be taught. So thank you very much, Lisa, for those reflections, because we are having an unending search for for this model, no, to try to apply at least for the in the Argentine landscape, no. So thank you. Yeah.
No, I appreciate hearing your comments too. It's very evocative for me to think through what you're saying as well. And I would just add to it, we are entering, in terms of the technological, we're entering a very concerning phase of algorithmic control, artificial intelligence, and automation of information technologies and media systems. And some are really concerned in the humanities about the questions that you raise of ethics and care and even justice. And so, like, some of these systems would threaten to take human choice or expression or intervention out of technological processes and allow machinic control. And I think it's really important for humanists to be tracking this because it raises new questions about sovereignty. Sovereignty isn't, of course, just about state power. It's also about the human, right? And it's about choice and will and desire. And so I think we have to be thinking about, like, how are systems being designed, especially in my country. Unfortunately, with the big tech control of the global economy, there's all kinds of systems being rolled out where people don't have the power to intervene, to choose, to control, to disrupt in the same ways that they historically had. And we need to be monitoring and tracking these issues because they're being rolled out all over the place, in mobile phone apps, in buildings, in cars, on public screens, and in smart cities. And I think that, we need to be, we have the digital humanities as a sort of subsector of the humanities. And most of the work that's starting to take shape recently is focusing on these questions and on AI and automation. And so that just adds a whole other set of concerns that we need to be thinking about across our national contexts.
There are lots of very difficult subjects and the question of what can humanities do there. Especially while education, as Jerry was also saying, is going towards just a technical thing and let the kids learn how to work with computers, but nothing else. And of course, that will only deepen what you're saying. Lisa, we still have a few minutes, and I would like to ask you something that maybe gets all these things together and also goes back to your field and what you were saying of this vertical mediation. I was overhearing a conversation the other day. I have a daughter, she's 21. She was with her friends and they were like very talking about the state of the world and very upset and very sad. And suddenly one of them said, we have to leave. We have to leave. We have to find another planet. We have to go somewhere else and go to live somewhere in another planet. And I was like, whoa, that's tough to hear. Very serious, it was said by one of these girls who's at college now. And I couldn't help but think about Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and all these millionaires launching their rockets to explore what's out there, and linking these two things. And I was wondering if you see something there, if you see some pattern, or if what do you think about this sudden urge of leaving? Is that the only thing that will be left for us?
Well, I'll say two things. The first is that I see the Bezos and all the Elon Musk and the launching of satellites as part of a history of colonialism and a neo-colonial control of the circumterrestrial space around the Earth. And there's a whole political economy of that process that would take a long time to talk through. So there's a kind of, part of me that wants to be very critical of that. On the other hand, what your daughters and the conversation just is very important to remember that that science fiction and speculation about our future can take many shapes and forms. And it is actually really important for us to listen to our students and learn from them and our youth, and to try to understand where they're at, given all the things that we're facing in this world right now. And the humanities tends to always think, oh, let's go back into the kind of continental philosophy tradition or in the classical models. And those are all very important. But there's been so much research in the past 50 years to try to decolonize the Eurocentrism that has governed a lot of humanities scholarship over its long legacy. And we need emergent voices from all parts of the world. We need to make sure that they're published in their native languages and translated. And, we need research to emerge both in writing, but also in multiple forms. That's one of the reasons I wanted to work with artists, is because I wanted scholarship to take shape and form in other versions. I didn't want it to just be a peer-reviewed journal article or a book that no one would read. I wanted to work with artists so that they could help me think through translating ideas into a public forum and venue. So I think we have a scary thing with what's happening around the Earth right now with the colonization of orbit. There's incredible orbital congestion happening because of all the satellites that are going up, and there are public health dangers and risks with that, with things falling and pollution related to what's happening around the Earth. And there's very little regulation of it. On the one hand, and we have a whole set of issues there. And then we have the emerging voices, especially of young girls, that inspire us to think about other places and futures, and to remind us that it's up to us to make a place where we want to live and live together. And if that's not one of the fundamental questions of the humanities, I don't know what is.
Lisa, thank you so very, very much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Gabby. It's my pleasure. And thanks to all of you for being here. And I hope we can be in touch, and just take care, everybody, and stay safe.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.